How can you deploy a .NET Aspire application into Azure? That's what we're going to unpack in this video. We're going to start by deploying a simple application, and then we're going to spice it up by introducing more infrastructure components, and I'll show you how you can incrementally deploy that using .NET Aspire and the Azure Developer CLI. This is the .NET Aspire application that I want to deploy into Azure. We have a Redis service, an API project, which is our backend, and a Blazor client application is going to expose a user interface. And this is actually the Aspire starter template, which comes with these services pre-configured. So you can easily set this up and then test it out to see if you can deploy this application into Azure. Our client application is referencing both the Redis and the backend service so that it's able to communicate with them. And it's also exposing external HTTP endpoints so that it's available when we deploy it into Azure. But first, let's run this locally. And this is going to open up the Aspire dashboard where you can see the services that you have running. So we have our Redis container, the API service, and the Blazor application. If I open up the Blazor app, I can navigate through the app. I can go to the weather component that's going to send a request to our backend, which you can see in the distributed traces here. So if I check this trace, you can see that I'm requesting the weather component from the Blazor application. This is sending a request to the weather forecast endpoint on the API service. And finally, everything is cached inside of Redis so that it's served from the Blazor application using output caching. So these are the initial resources that I want to deploy using the Azure Developer CLI. So let me show you how we can do this. In order to get started, you're going to need an Azure account, of course, and you're going to need to install the Azure Developer CLI that you can interact with using the AZD command. The first action you want to do is AZD auth login so that you can actually authenticate with the Azure Developer CLI. And then we can go into the Aspire specific parts. And the first command that you want to run from the root folder of your Aspire application is AZD init. So let's go ahead and run this. And this is going to prompt me to initialize the application that I want to deploy. Now I'm going to say that I want to use the code in the current directory, and then AZD is going to scan the folder structure and figure out what type of application I'm trying to deploy. And you can see that it detects that I have an Aspire application. It says so here. And this is going to try to deploy this into the Azure Container Apps. This is a managed service on Azure that allows you to easily deploy your applications inside of containers. And I actually released a video a few weeks ago showing you how to implement CI/CD using Azure Container Apps. Now, for our use case, I'm going to say that I agree that yes, this is a .NET Aspire app and I want to deploy this using Azure Container Apps. Now I need to give this a name, and this is going to create a resource group. It's going to contain all of the components that I need to provision. So let's call this the Aspire Demo 001, for example, and I'm going to click enter, and then this is going to initialize two files in the root folder. The first file is Azure YAML, and then the next steps markdown document. If I open these up in VS Code, the Azure YAML just contains the path to your Aspire project, and the next steps markdown document contains some detailed instructions into how you can go about deploying this after initialization. So back inside of our console, the next command that I would need to run is AZD up. And what this is going to do is first provision all of the resources that are needed to run my application, and then it's going to deploy my individual applications. Now you can also do this in two separate steps, which I am going to do here. And the first command you want to run is AZD provision. And I'm going to run this. And this is first going to prompt me for my Azure subscription, which I'm going to choose. Then it's going to ask me for a region where I want to host my Aspire application. I'm going to choose one that is geographically close to me. And then it's going to proceed to create our resource group for my deployment. And then finally provision the components that I'm going to need to run this Aspire application. Now I'm going to give this a few moments to spin up the resources that we need, and then I'll show you what's created. After a few minutes, this step is going to complete and we can observe the resources that were provisioned. And the first one is a resource group that has the same name as the environment that I just configured here. Then we have a log analytics workspace, a container registry is going to manage the applications that we will deploy to the Azure Container Apps service. And then we have a Container Apps environment. So let's check this out in Azure before we deploy the actual applications. If I open up the resource group, you can see the four resources that I just mentioned: a container registry, a Container Apps environment, a log analytics workspace, and a managed identity is going to allow us to manage authentication for this Aspire deployment. One of the responsibilities of the managed identity here is allowing us to push our applications as containers into the container registry. Now, I want to comment on the Container Apps environment, and I'm going to refer to the documentation for this. And this is actually an isolation boundary, as you can see here, that acts like a virtual network where you can host your container apps. And your container apps are going to be actual Docker containers that you can use to spin up your applications. This opens up some very interesting possibilities, and one of those, which I'm going to show you, is being able to hide a container app inside of an environment and only expose a specific container app instance. So you're going to see how we can achieve this from our .NET Aspire setup. And if you recall my earlier remark of using with external HTTP endpoints, this is precisely how we can expose or hide a container app inside of a container app environment. Now let's actually see how we're going to deploy our free services into Azure. So after we have provisioned our resources, the deployment is really straightforward. All we have to do is say AZD deploy, and this is going to start the deployment process. AZD is going to scan our Aspire setup and is going to figure out which services we have currently. So you can see that right now it's deploying my API service, and what's going to happen is it's going to create a Docker image for my API service, push that image into the container registry, and then create an Azure Container App using that image. And after this completes, you can see that we get an endpoint where we can try to access our API service. We have HTTPS out of the box. This is a feature of Azure Container Apps. Now you can see an interesting part of the URL here, which is internal. And this is what I was talking about with the Azure Container environment and being able to hide or expose Azure Container Apps. The API service and the Redis containers are going to be internal to the Azure Container environment, meaning that you can only access them from the environment itself, but you can't access these services from the outside. The Blazor UI doesn't have the internal component in the URL, and it's accessible to the outside world. Now, what's really awesome about .NET Aspire is that you also get an Aspire dashboard deployment out of the box. So let's go ahead and check this out. If I open the Aspire dashboard from the browser, I'm going to be first prompted to authenticate to Azure, and once I do that, I'm navigated to the Resources tab, where we can see our actual resources. Now I can open up the Blazor application, for example, and this is our Blazor app that's hosted in the Azure Container Apps. You can see that we get some URL, which you can customize if you want to. Now, if I go into the distributed traces, this also works out of the box, and you can see the trace here accessing the weather component, which is going to check if this is available in the cache, and if it's not, is going to check in the API service. That's going to give us back the response, and then we're going to cache this. So everything is also working in Azure, and we managed to deploy this in a matter of minutes. But let me go back to the Azure portal, and I'm going to refresh my resource group, and here you can see 3 additional container apps: the API service, the cache, and the web frontend. This is our Blazor application. And I'm going to go into the container app for the Blazor app, for the Blazor application, because I want to show you the environment variables. And one thing I really like with Aspire is how it enables service discovery. For example, you can see the environment variables here that allow us to do service discovery, and the values are set to the address of the API service. Now notice that the API service is internal, meaning we can't access it from the outside, but it's available in the container app environment. There's also the connection string for Redis, which is managed through a secret value, and all of this is wired up with .NET Aspire and the AZD CLI. So that's the base case. Now let's make this more interesting by introducing another component. I'm going to install a NuGet package in my Aspire app host project, and I'm going to look for Aspire Postgres. And the NuGet package I want to install is Aspire hosting Azure Postgres. And this is because I want to deploy this database using the managed Postgres service in the Azure cloud. Now let's go ahead and wire up our service. So I'm first going to create my Postgres database by saying builder add Postgres, and let's call this just Postgres. Now I can take this resource and create a database that I want, and I'm going to call this stocks. And let's create a variable to capture the stocks database. And what I want to do is be able to reference this database from my API project. An interesting thing that you can do with Aspire is wait for any downstream dependencies to start up before you can run your project. And I'd like to be able to wait for the Postgres container to be available before I can run the backend. At the time of recording this video, the wait for method isn't natively available, so you can introduce it by adding a NuGet package. And this will allow me to wait for the Postgres container to start up before running my backend. So this is enough to configure a connection from the API service to my Postgres container. I'm also going to expose this by calling with external HTTP endpoints so that I can access my API service once it's deployed to Azure. Now, I also need to make some changes to the actual backend, and I'm going to add an Aspire component by saying add.NET Aspire package, and the one I want to install is Aspire MPG SQL. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm also going to install Dapper so that I can quickly expose some functionality from my API, and then I'm going to add some code that I prepared behind the scenes. So I'm going to add a database initializer class, and I'll show you what it does in just a moment. Now, with the NuGet package that I installed, I have a new extension method called add mpg SQL data source, and I can use this to reference a connection to the stocks database, and this is going to create a data source using this connection string. All of this is wired up by .NET Aspire behind the scenes. And what is the functionality that I want to expose? Well, it's going to be just one endpoint called stock prices, and we're going to use the mpg SQL data source that's made available by calling this extension method. And now I can inject this service, open up a database connection, execute a query using Dapper, and return the response from this endpoint. And in the database initializer, I'm going to check that my stocks database exists. If it does not, I'm going to create it. Then I'm going to initialize the database schema and create the table. And then I'm going to seed some dummy data so that we actually have what to return from our get endpoint. Now I need to register this as a hosted service. So I'm going to say builder services add hosted service, and I'll specify the database initializer. So if I go ahead and run this locally, it's going to start my Postgres container, and it's also going to initialize my database. If I check out the API service, you can see that now it's wired up with a connection string, which is called stocks, and this is pointing to my specific database. If I go into the logs for the API service, you can see that we are creating our table in the database. So everything is initialized once I start the application from a background worker. And if I go into Postman and send a request to the stock prices endpoint, I will get back a response that contains the data that I seed when I first start the application. So everything is working on my local machine. Now, before I'm able to deploy this, I need to make one more adjustment to my Aspire setup. And that is with my Postgres service, I have to add a call to another method called publish as Azure Postgres Flexible Server. And this is going to take care of provisioning the required resource in Azure. Now, if I open up the console, I'm going to run AZD provision again. You could also do AZD up, and this is going to do a provision and the deploy step all at once, but I like to take this one step at a time so that we can see in more detail what is going on. So let's run AZD provision. This is going to take a look at the existing resources that we have, and if they exist, it's just going to skip them. So this refers to the container app environment, the log analytics workspace, the managed identity. However, because we don't have a Postgres instance running in Azure, then it's going to need to create it. You can see that it's also spinning up a key vault instance, and this will allow me to safely expose my connection string to the Postgres database by using a secret inside of the Azure Key Vault. My API service, the backend, is going to get the value of this secret directly from Key Vault. And of course, this is going to take some time, so I'm going to skip to when the provision step completes. And after a few minutes, the provision step completes, and now we have a Postgres database running in Azure. Now I'm going to run AZD deploy to kick off the deployment step, and while that's going on, let's go into Azure for a moment. If I refresh my resource group, you can see there's now a Key Vault instance and an Azure database for Postgres. And this is our actual Postgres database that we're going to be using from the backend application. If you want to be able to connect to your Postgres instance from your local machine, then you have to expose your local IP address in the networking settings. Now I'm going to go back to my resource group, and behind the scenes, my deployment is going on. So let's check out if that's completed. And you can see that it's almost done. The Blazor frontend is the only thing that's left, but I want you to take a look at the URL for the API service. The internal component is no longer there. And if I go into the Aspire dashboard, you may need to refresh this to get the latest state of your services. And I'm going to go into the logs for the API service. So let's see what's happening there. And you can see that I have some logs from my background worker that's initializing my database. So it's going to create the stock prices table and insert some dummy data inside. Now, if I go into Azure and open up the API service container app, I will be able to copy the public URL of this service and then go into Postman and specify this address here and send a request to the stock prices endpoint, and you can see that we get a response containing our stocks that are now stored in the Postgres database that we also provisioned using Aspire. But what's actually happening behind the scenes is we're setting up an additional environment variable that is a connection string to the stocks database. And of course, this is referenced through a secret instead of hard coding the connection string. So you can see how we can easily spin up an application using .NET Aspire and deploy that to Azure. And it's going to create a resource group for us where we can manage all of our resources. You can provision and deprovision resources as you need them. You can even manually delete them from here and then re-provision them again if you want to do that. And you can control what is going on from the Aspire dashboard. So you have access to your application traces. For example, I can go here and take a look at the trace and see what's going on when I send a request to the stock prices endpoint. So you can see there is a request to my API. This is the span here. And then there is a query to my database. And we can even observe what is the SQL that was sent to the database. In this case, it's just a simple select statement. Lastly, I want to show you how you can deprovision your resources. All you have to do is say AZD down. And this is going to go ahead and deprovision the log analytics workspace, the container app environment, container registry, and essentially delete your entire resource group. So first it's going to scan your Aspire project, figure out what are the resources that you have provisioned, and then it's going to prompt you if you really want to do this. So if I type in yes, it's going to delete all of my services one by one, where essentially it's just removing the entire resource group. So you can see that deployment with .NET Aspire to Azure is pretty solid, and I hope you got value from this video. If you want to learn how to manually implement a CI/CD pipeline using Azure Container Apps, then you should watch this video next. Check out my courses to improve your skills, and until next time, stay awesome.